You will marry the Duke tomorrow." Isa McLaren stared at her father across the dim chamber where her sister's body still lay beneath a white linen sheet. For a moment she thought she had misheard. "Grace was meant to marry him," Isa whispered hoarsely. Her father's eyes were hollow with grief, yet behind the sorrow lived something colder: fear. "Grace is dead," he said quietly. "But the marriage must still happen." Outside the window, the Highland wind howled against the stone house as if the mountains themselves protested. Isa felt the room tilt. "You cannot mean—" "You will take her place." The words fell like iron chains. 3 days later, snow drifted across the moors like scattered petals from a wedding that should never have existed. Isa McLaren sat inside the carriage as wee Clydesmore Castle rose from the frozen hills, its black stone towers cutting into the pale Scottish sky. The castle looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the world away. Or perhaps to trap those foolish enough to enter. Her fingers tightened around a small green tartan ribbon, Grace's ribbon. Grace had embroidered it for the wedding dress she would never wear. Isa pressed the fabric to her lips for a moment. Then she lowered it. There was no time left for mourning. Grace McLaren had died 5 days before the wedding, and now Isa carried not only grief but deception. Because when the Duke of Clydesmore welcomed his bride, he would not be welcoming Grace. He would be welcoming her sister. Isa had never been the daughter meant for aristocratic marriage. Grace had been perfect. Grace played the pianoforte with delicate precision. Grace embroidered silk flowers and spoke with the gentle patience expected of a future duchess. Grace knew how to glide through drawing rooms and speak softly to powerful men. Isa had grown up differently. She rode horses across the highlands like a storm. Her hands bore calluses from reins and work. She spoke too quickly, laughed too loudly, and rarely remembered to lower her eyes when challenged. Grace soothed rooms. Isa unsettled them, which made the lie all the more dangerous, because the Duke of Clydesmore, Rowan Sinclair, was not a man easily deceived. Stories of him had reached the Highlands long before the marriage negotiations began. A duke feared in London society, a man whose heart had hardened after the tragic death of his elder brother, a man who trusted no one, and now Isa was about to stand before him pretending to be someone else. The carriage rolled through the iron gates. Snow crunched beneath the wheels as servants hurried forward. One opened the door. "My lady," he said respectfully. The title struck Isa like a blade. Lady, Duchess, Bride, every word belonged to Grace. But Isa stepped down anyway, because if the marriage failed, her clan would lose everything. The disputed lands, the fragile peace with the Sinclairs, her father's honor, her family's survival. So Isa lifted her chin and walked toward the castle doors as though she had been born to them, even while the lie burned in her chest. The entrance hall of Clydesmore was vast and silent. Tall windows filtered pale winter light across black marble floors. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched from the walls like silent judges. The castle smelled faintly of candle wax and something older, loneliness. A severe woman in black approached and offered a precise curtsy. "Lady McLaren," she said. Isa forced herself not to react. "The Duke awaits you in the library." Of course he did. A duke did not come greet his bride like an eager suitor. He waited. Isa nodded. "Thank you." The housekeeper studied her for a fraction too long, then turned. "Follow me." The corridors seemed endless. Cold drafts moved through ancient tapestries. Every step echoed. Isa felt as though the castle itself were listening, judging, measuring. By the time they reached the library, her heartbeat had become painfully loud. The door opened. The room was enormous, shelves climbing toward the ceiling, tall windows overlooking the snowy gardens. And before the fireplace stood a man. His back was turned, his posture rigid. The housekeeper announced quietly, "Your Grace, Lady McLaren has arrived." Then she withdrew. The door closed behind Isa with a soft but final click. The man turned. Rowan Sinclair, Duke of Clydesmore. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 28, but there was nothing youthful about him. Sharp features, dark hair, eyes so deep brown they looked almost black, and a thin scar running from temple to jaw. Not a soldier's scar, something closer, something personal. He studied her without greeting, without warmth. "So," he said at last. His voice was calm, controlled. "You are the bride sent to me." Isa forced herself not to flinch. "I am." Silence stretched, heavy. Then he stepped closer, not enough to break propriety, but enough for Isa to feel the quiet intensity of his gaze. "The wedding will take place tomorrow," he said, "as agreed." "Yes." Another pause. Then Rowan added in the same cool tone, You should understand something before we proceed. Isa braced herself. This marriage, he continued, exists for alliance, land, politics. His eyes never left hers. Do not expect affection. The words struck harder than they should have. I will fulfill my duty as husband, he finished. But nothing more. Isa should have lowered her gaze. Grace would have. Grace would have responded gently. Instead, Isa said quietly, "Then we understand each other." His brows lifted slightly. "I expect nothing you do not wish to give." The silence that followed changed. It sharpened. Rowan stepped closer. For the first time his expression shifted, not anger. Interest. "You are not what I expected," he murmured. Isa felt her pulse quicken. "And your grace," she replied softly, "is exactly what I was warned about." For a moment the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more dangerous. The smile of a man who had just discovered something intriguing. "Welcome to Clydesmore," he said quietly. Then his voice lowered slightly. "I sincerely hope you survive what you have walked into." Isa stood alone in the library long after he left, and deep in her chest a terrible certainty settled. She had made her first mistake already, because Rowan Sinclair was not a man who missed details, and Isa McLaren, pretending to be Grace, had already begun to reveal the truth. Rowan Sinclair did not sleep that night. The castle had long fallen silent, yet he remained awake in the library, standing before the tall window overlooking the snow-covered courtyard. Something about his bride was wrong. He had felt it the moment she walked through the door. The woman introduced as Grace McLaren did not move like the woman described in the letters her father had sent for months. Grace, according to those letters, was gentle, soft-spoken. Grace was supposed to glide through a room like a well-trained diplomat. But the woman Rowan had met that afternoon carried herself like someone used to open wind and rough ground. Not drawing rooms, not courtly silence. Something in her posture had been too steady, too direct, almost defiant. Rowan frowned slightly as he replayed the moment in his mind, especially the way she had answered him. Most women in her position would have lowered their gaze when he declared the marriage would hold no affection. But she had not lowered her eyes. She had met his gaze, calmly, almost like a challenge. That alone would have been unusual, but it was not the only thing. A quiet knock sounded at the door. "Enter." Mrs. Abernathy stepped inside carrying a candle. She had served the Sinclair household for nearly 30 years and possessed the unsettling habit of noticing everything. "Your Grace should rest," she said gently. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Rowan did not move from the window. "What did you observe of her?" The housekeeper paused. "The bride?" "Yes." Mrs. Abernathy chose her words carefully. "She is not what I expected." Rowan glanced over his shoulder. "How so?" "She interrupted me," the housekeeper said calmly. "I offered to escort her to her chambers first. She insisted on meeting you immediately." Rowan's brow lifted slightly. "That seems reasonable." "For most people, perhaps," Mrs. Abernathy replied, "but not for the kind of bride her father described." She stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly. "And there were other things." "Such as?" "The maids assisted her with changing," she said. "They noticed marks on her hands." Rowan turned fully now. "What kind of marks?" "Calluses." The word hung in the air. "Not embroidery calluses," she continued carefully. "Riding calluses." Rowan felt a faint chill run through him. Grace McLaren was supposed to be a refined Highland lady, not someone accustomed to gripping reins for hours. Mrs. Abernathy continued. She also refused assistance from the maids at first. Refused? She seemed uncomfortable with being dressed. The housekeeper folded her hands, as though she had never grown used to servants. Rowan stared back toward the snow outside. "Interesting, very interesting. And one more thing," Mrs. Abernathy added. "She did not attend dinner." Rowan turned. She asked for her meal to be brought to her chambers. "That is not unusual." "No," the housekeeper said quietly. "But the maid said they heard her pacing for hours." Rowan felt something tighten in his chest. "Pacing?" "Yes." Mrs. Abernathy hesitated, as if she were repeating something to herself. "What sort of thing?" The housekeeper gave a small, uncertain shake of her head. They could not hear clearly. But one word was repeated several times. Rowan waited. "Grace." Silence filled the library. Rowan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Someone repeating their own name like a lesson. Someone practicing, like an actress learning a role. After Mrs. Abernathy left, Rowan remained motionless for several minutes. Snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the courtyard in quiet white. Tomorrow he would marry that woman. For the sake of land agreements. For the sake of ending decades of clan tension. For the sake of duty, love had nothing to do with it. Love had died years ago in a barn when Rowan found his brother Malcolm hanging from the rafters with a farewell letter in his hand. Since that day, Rowan trusted nothing. Not affection, not promises, not appearances, which meant if something was wrong, he would find it. Later that night, Rowan walked through the silent corridors of the East Wing. Servants' candles had long been extinguished. The castle slept, but one thin strip of light glowed beneath the door. Her door. He stopped outside it. Inside, he heard movement, footsteps, then a whisper. Rowan leaned closer. At first, the words were indistinct. Then he heard it, a voice repeating quietly, "My lady..." Pause. "My lady Grace McLaren." Silence. Then again, "My lady." Rowan's expression darkened slowly. Practicing, exactly as the housekeeper suspected. The Duke lifted his hand toward the door. His knuckles hovered inches from the wood. One knock, one question, and he could demand the truth immediately. But Rowan slowly lowered his hand. Tomorrow would reveal enough. Once she was his wife, the truth would belong to him. And if the McLaren clan believed they could deceive the Duke of Clydesmore, they had made a grave mistake. Rowan turned away from the door and walked down the corridor. Yet as he reached the staircase, something unexpected followed him. Not anger, not suspicion, something far more inconvenient. Curiosity, because the woman inside that room was nothing like the bride he had expected. And Rowan Sinclair had learned long ago that unexpected women were the most dangerous kind, especially for men who had sworn never to care again. Morning came cold and pale over Ingbert Clydesmore Castle. Isa McLaren woke before dawn, her heart already racing with the terrible knowledge of what the day demanded. Today she would marry a man who did not know her. Today she would speak vows beneath a name that was not hers. Today the lie would become law. For a moment she remained still beneath the heavy velvet curtains, staring at the carved ceiling above her bed. Grace should have been here. Grace should have been the one wearing the wedding gown waiting beside the wardrobe. Grace should have been the bride walking into that chapel. Instead, Grace lay buried beneath Highland soil, and Isa would take her place. A knock sounded at the door. "Enter," Isa said quietly. 3 maids entered carrying the wedding dress. The gown seemed to float between them, ivory silk, long sleeves, high collar, elegant, severe, beautiful in the restrained way aristocratic marriages often were. Yet there was something mournful about it. No pearls, no flowers, no music, just a dress made for a contract. One maid curtsied. "Your Grace will be ready shortly." Isa felt the title pierce through her chest. Grace. They believed she was Grace. She forced herself to nod. "Thank you." The maids began their work. The corset tightened slowly around her ribs. Pins slipped through dark hair, shaping it into the same elegant arrangement Grace always wore. Every movement felt like someone sculpting her into another woman. When they finished, Isa turned toward the mirror. Grace stared back. The resemblance was perfect. Twin sisters. Same eyes. Same mouth. Same delicate bone structure. Yet Isa could still see the difference. Grace's gaze had always been gentle. Isa's carried fire. The walk to the chapel felt endless. Mrs. Abernathy escorted her through corridors where morning light barely reached. Servants bowed quietly as she passed. None of them knew, none of them suspected. Yet Isa could not shake the feeling that the castle itself understood the truth. At last they reached the chapel doors. The room was small and austere. Stained glass filtered pale winter light across the stone floor. There were no guests, no musicians, no celebration. Clydesmore remained in mourning for the Duke's brother, which made the silent ceremony convenient for everyone involved, except perhaps Isa. At the altar stood Rowan Sinclair, dressed entirely in black, tall, immovable, waiting. He turned as she entered. Their eyes met. For a moment Isa felt as if he could see straight through the silk layers to the beating heart beneath them. The priest cleared his throat nervously. "Shall we begin?" The ceremony passed in a strange haze. Latin prayers echoed off stone walls. Isa repeated each vow carefully. Her voice did not tremble. She'd rehearsed those words all night. Rowan's voice remained steady as well. Cold, measured, the voice of a man completing an obligation. When the moment came for the ring, Rowan took her hand. His fingers were warm against her skin. Isa forced herself not to pull away. He slid the gold band onto her finger. Their eyes met again. Something flickered in his gaze. Not tenderness. Something sharper. Recognition, perhaps. Or suspicion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the priest said. The words dropped heavily into the quiet chapel. Rowan inclined his head politely. But he did not kiss her. Instead he stepped back. The ceremony was finished. The lie had been sealed before God. They returned to the castle in silence. A small meal had been arranged in the dining hall. Issa sat to Rowan's left at the long table. The distance between them felt enormous. Servants poured wine, placed dishes, then withdrew quietly. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Finally Rowan lifted his glass. "You are very quiet today," he said. His tone carried no warmth. "Yesterday you seemed far more spirited." Issa met his gaze carefully. "And what did you expect, Your Grace?" "That depends," he replied calmly. "On which version of you I am speaking to." Her stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Rowan set his glass down with deliberate precision. Then he rose. Slowly he walked around the table, stopped beside her chair, close enough that Issa could feel the quiet intensity of his presence. "You see," he said softly, "there are details that trouble me." Issa's pulse began to hammer. "The calluses on your hands. The way your accent thickens when you are irritated. The way you hesitate when addressed as my lady." Each observation struck like a small blade. "And finally," Rowan continued quietly, "the way you spoke your vows." Issa's breath caught. "How so?" Rowan leaned slightly closer. "Grace McLaren," he said calmly, "would never have looked at me the way you did." Silence crushed the room. Issa's fingers tightened around the tablecloth. Rowan studied her face carefully. Then he spoke the words that shattered the illusion. "Who are you?" Her heart stopped. "I beg your pardon. Do not lie." His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute command. "I know Grace McLaren had a twin sister." The world seemed to tilt beneath Issa. Rowan's eyes never left hers. "So I will ask you once more." His voice dropped lower. "Who are you?" The lie collapsed inside her chest. Grace's grave, her father's desperate command, the vows she had just spoken. All of it rushed through her mind at once. When Issa finally spoke, her voice barely existed. "My name." Her hands trembled. "Is Issa." The silence that followed felt endless. Rowan did not move, but something inside his expression fractured. "Issa," he repeated quietly. "Grace's sister." Tears burned behind Issa's eyes. "Yes." His next question came like steel. "Where is Grace?" Issa closed her eyes. The truth felt like swallowing glass. "She died." Rowan stepped back as if struck. "When?" 5 days before the wedding." Silence filled the hall. "I was sent in her place." Her voice broke. "My father said the alliance could not fail." Rowan stared at her for a long moment. Shock, anger, something deeper. Then his expression hardened. "I married an imposter." Issa rose unsteadily. "Your Grace, I never—" "Enough." The single word stopped her cold. Rowan turned away from her. His voice returned to that cold, aristocratic control. "If you had intended honesty," he said quietly, "you would have spoken before the vows." Issa felt tears spill freely now. "I had no choice." Rowan did not turn back. "Leave me." The words were soft, but final. Issa walked from the hall with trembling steps. When she reached her chambers, the door closed behind her like a prison gate. She collapsed to the floor. The wedding gown spread around her like shattered wings. And for the first time since Grace's death, Issa McLaren allowed herself to weep, because now she understood something with terrible clarity. Rowan Sinclair was not a man who forgave easily, and she had begun their marriage with the worst betrayal imaginable. Rowan Sinclair remained in the dining hall long after Issa fled the room. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls of Clydesmore. His wife, an imposter, a stranger wearing another woman's name. Rowan stood perfectly still beside the table, his hands resting on the polished wood as he forced his mind to settle. Anger was there, yes, but beneath it lived something far more dangerous. Recognition. Because the moment Issa whispered the truth, something in her voice had sounded painfully familiar. The voice of someone carrying grief too heavy to hide. Rowan left the hall and walked through the silent castle corridors. His steps eventually carried him outside. Night had settled over the estate. Snow still covered the gardens, glowing faintly beneath the moon. He walked without thinking until the dark iron gates of the Naim Sinclair family cemetery appeared between the trees. There he stopped, before the newest grave, Malcolm Sinclair. His brother, the man who should have been Duke. Rowan stood staring at the stone for a long time. "You believed love was worth everything," Rowan murmured quietly into the cold night. His breath formed pale clouds in the air. "And look where it brought you." Malcolm had been the opposite of him. Warm, charming, a man who trusted easily, a man who fell deeply in love with a woman their father refused to accept. That love had destroyed him. Rowan still remembered opening the barn doors that morning. The rope, the letter, the unbearable silence afterward. Since then, Rowan had built his life carefully. Duty, control, distance, no weakness, no vulnerability. And now fate had delivered him another deception wrapped in vows. Yet when Rowan closed his eyes, he did not see Grace. He saw Issa, the way her voice broke when she spoke of her sister, the way she had confessed without bargaining, without excuses, without trying to save herself. That part unsettled him more than the lie itself. Most people lied to protect themselves. Issa McLaren had told the truth knowing it would destroy her. Rowan exhaled slowly. He hated complications, and Issa McLaren was the most complicated thing that had ever entered his life. When he returned to the castle, the halls were silent again. Servants had long since retired. Only one candle burned in the east wing corridor, outside Issa's chamber door. Rowan stopped there. The instinct to knock returned. He imagined her inside, still wearing the wedding gown, still crying. For a brief moment his hand lifted toward the door. Then he lowered it again. Forgiveness was not something he offered lightly, and he was not yet certain what he felt. Anger, pity, curiosity. Something else he refused to name. Rowan turned away and walked back down the corridor. The next 3 days passed with unusual quiet in Clydesmore. Issa did not leave her chambers. Meals were delivered to her door. She thanked the servants politely but avoided conversation. Shame was a harsher prison than any locked door. On the third afternoon, Mrs. Abernathy entered her room carrying a folded dress. "The Duke requests your presence in his study," she said calmly. "Today at 3. Issa's stomach twisted painfully. Requests from a duke were rarely requests. "Thank you," she whispered. At exactly 3 o'clock, Issa knocked on the study door. "Enter." Rowan stood beside the window, his back turned. When she stepped inside, he gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Issa obeyed. The silence stretched between them, heavy, measured. Finally, Rowan spoke. "I have spent the last 3 days considering our situation." His tone was calm, almost too calm. "There are legal grounds for annulling the marriage." Issa's chest tightened. Of course there were. Fraud, deception. Everything pointed in his favor. "But," Rowan continued slowly, "doing so would ignite conflict between our families." He turned toward her. The alliance between Sinclair and McLaren lands would collapse. Issa lowered her gaze. "That would be understandable." Rowan studied her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "And it would destroy your reputation entirely." Her head lifted slightly in surprise. "I did not expect that to concern you." Rowan leaned one shoulder against the desk. "It does not concern me emotionally," he said evenly. "But it concerns me strategically." Issa almost smiled bitterly. "Of course. The scandal would damage both houses," Rowan continued. "Therefore the marriage will stand." Issa blinked. "What?" "You will remain Duchess of Clydesmore." Shock froze her in place. "We will appear together when necessary," Rowan said. "You will occupy your chambers, I will occupy mine." His voice softened slightly. "There will be no expectations beyond public duty." Issa swallowed. It was more mercy than she had expected, and yet the distance between them hurt more than she anticipated. "Grace would have been better suited for you," she said quietly. She knew how to belong in a place like this. Rowan watched her carefully. "And you believe you do not?" Issa shook her head faintly. "I was always the wrong daughter. Too stubborn. Too loud. Too wild for drawing rooms." Her voice faltered. "Grace was everything my father hoped for." Rowan remained silent, listening. Finally he said, "And who is Issa McLaren?" The question startled her. Issa hesitated. "I don't entirely know anymore." She looked toward the window. "I only know that when Grace died, something in me died with her." Her voice grew softer, and stepping into her life felt like burying the rest. For a long moment Rowan said nothing. Then quietly he spoke. "I found my brother hanging from a barn beam." Issa looked up sharply. Rowan's expression remained composed. "But I stood there for hours before I could move." His gaze drifted toward the snow outside. "Loss leaves strange ghosts behind." Issa stepped forward without thinking. "I'm sorry," she said gently. Rowan turned back to her. Their eyes met. For the first time since their confrontation, the hostility between them had faded, not vanished, but changed. "Do not mistake this conversation for forgiveness," Rowan said quietly. "The wound remains." Issa nodded slowly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. Only time." Rowan studied her a moment longer. Then he gave a single, almost reluctant nod. "Very well." For the first time since their disastrous wedding, a fragile truce settled between them. Not trust, not friendship, but something slightly more hopeful than silence. And somewhere deep inside Rowan Sinclair's guarded heart, a small crack had begun to form. Life inside, Clydesmore Castle settled into a strange and cautious rhythm. Issa rarely saw Rowan during the day. The Duke spent long hours managing estate matters, meeting with stewards, inspecting the lands, and answering letters from London that arrived sealed with the heavy weight of politics. Issa kept mostly to the library or the gardens. Mrs. Abernathy, with quiet efficiency, began guiding her through the duties expected of a duchess, which proved far more difficult than Issa expected. One morning the housekeeper found her attempting to lace her own corset. "My lady," Mrs. Abernathy sighed patiently, "a duchess does not dress herself." Issa tugged stubbornly at the ribbons. "In the Highlands I saddled my own horse and carried water from the river." "That may be true," the older woman replied, "but here servants observe everything. And if they see their duchess behaving like a stable hand—" Issa gave her a wry look. "Then perhaps they will learn that duchesses are human." Mrs. Abernathy tried very hard not to smile, but the argument remained unresolved. That afternoon, Rowan heard the disagreement while passing through the East Corridor. "I said I can manage it myself," Issa insisted inside the room. "Your Grace," a maid protested. Rowan knocked lightly. Silence fell instantly. "Enter," Issa called. When he stepped inside, Issa stood with her back to him, wearing only her linen shift while a maid struggled with the corset strings. Her hair spilled freely over her shoulders in dark waves. She quickly wrapped a shawl around herself when she noticed him. Rowan politely kept his gaze fixed on her face. "I apologize for the interruption," he said calmly. "I simply wished to speak with my wife." The words still sounded strange between them. The maids hurried away. Mrs. Abernathy followed with visible relief. When the door closed, Issa crossed her arms defensively. "You heard the argument?" "I did." "And?" Rowan leaned lightly against the wall. "The housekeeper is correct." Issa groaned softly. "You take her side." "I take the side of practicality," he replied. "People expect certain things from a duchess." Issa's eyes flashed. "People already expect the wrong woman." The words hung heavily between them. Rowan did not answer immediately. Finally he said quietly, "Which is precisely why we cannot afford additional suspicions." Issa's shoulders sagged slightly. The truth of that stung. "I dislike pretending," she muttered. "I know." The softness in his tone surprised her. Rowan stepped closer. "Which is why," he continued, "I propose a solution." Issa looked up warily. "What kind of solution?" "We speak." "That hardly sounds revolutionary." He almost smiled. "Not speak as strangers forced into a contract, but as partners who must learn how to survive this arrangement." Issa studied him carefully. "And what would those conversations involve?" "Everything. Estate matters, society expectations, the rules of this world you have been thrown into." His gaze held hers steadily. "I can teach you." Issa frowned slightly. "And what do you gain from this arrangement?" Rowan considered the question. "Peace in my own house." That answer, oddly enough, felt honest. After a moment, Issa nodded slowly. "Very well. When do these lessons begin?" Rowan's expression remained composed. "Tonight." That evening, the small salon beside the library was prepared for dinner. No grand table, no formal servants hovering nearby, just a modest meal, 2 chairs, and quiet candlelight. Issa arrived uncertain what to expect. Rowan was already there. He rose when she entered, a gesture so simple it startled her. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening." They sat. The first minutes passed awkwardly. Rowan spoke of estate matters, harvests, tenant agreements, road repairs damaged by winter storms. Issa listened carefully, occasionally asking questions. Gradually, the stiffness between them began to ease. Later, when the plates had been cleared, Rowan asked, "What did you enjoy in the Highlands?" Issa's eyes brightened faintly. "Horses. Riding through the valleys before sunrise. Watching storms roll over the mountains." Her voice softened with memory. "There is a river near our home that never fully freezes." Rowan listened quietly. "I imagine that must be beautiful." "It is." She hesitated. "What about you?" Rowan leaned back slightly. "Books." Issa blinked. "That seems unexpectedly simple for a duke." "I never enjoyed crowded ballrooms," he admitted. "My brother was the charming one." Issa studied him. "And you?" "I preferred observing from the edges." A brief silence followed. Then Issa said thoughtfully, "You are not nearly as cold as people say." Rowan raised an eyebrow. "And what do they say?" "That you are made of stone. Unfeeling. Impossible to approach." Rowan considered that. "Perhaps I encouraged that reputation." Issa tilted her head. "Why?" He looked directly at her. "Because stone is difficult to wound." The honesty of the answer caught her off guard. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Issa gave a small laugh. I must admit something. What? I expected a tyrant. Rowan almost smiled. And I expected a delicate bride who fainted easily. Their eyes met. Something warm flickered briefly between them. Not love, not yet, but something gentler than hostility. When the evening ended, Rowan walked her to her chamber door. They paused there awkwardly. Thank you for dinner, Issa said softly. It was less uncomfortable than I feared. That may be the closest thing to a compliment I received tonight. She smiled faintly. Rowan hesitated. Then he reached for her hand, slowly, carefully. He lifted her fingers and brushed them with his lips in a formal gesture. The touch lasted only a moment, but Issa felt it like a spark. Good night, Your Grace, he murmured. She swallowed. Good night, Rowan. The sound of his name in her voice lingered long after he walked away. And that night both of them realized something unsettling. The wall between them, built from lies and resentment, had begun to crack. The days that followed settled into a pattern neither Rowan nor Issa had expected. Dinner in the small salon became routine. At first the conversations remained cautious. Estate matters, books, small details of life inside on Clydesmore Castle. But slowly the distance between them shifted, not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough that silence no longer felt like a battlefield. One evening Issa arrived late, breathless from the cold. A loose curl had escaped her pinned hair. Rowan noticed immediately. You have been outside again, he said. The gardens, she replied, removing her gloves. They are still half buried in snow. They will bloom soon. Her voice carried quiet certainty. Rowan studied her thoughtfully. You speak of the garden as if it belongs to you. Issa paused. I suppose it does now. The words surprised both of them. For the first time since arriving at Clydesmore, Issa sounded less like a visitor, and more like someone beginning to belong. A week later, Issa received a letter from the Highlands. She recognized her mother's handwriting immediately. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. The message was short, cold. Your marriage has been confirmed. You must fulfill your duty as wife and provide an heir. Do not fail where Grace would have succeeded. Issa stared at the letter long after finishing it. The words burned inside her chest. Heir, a child, something that required a marriage that was far more real than the one Rowan had offered. That evening, Rowan found her standing by the tall library window. The letter rested loosely in her hand. You look troubled, he said quietly. Issa hesitated. Then she handed him the letter. Rowan read it carefully. His jaw tightened slightly. They expect an heir, he said. Issa nodded faintly. They expect a real marriage? Silence settled heavily between them. Rowan folded the letter slowly. That expectation is unreasonable. Is it? Her voice carried a fragile edge. Because from their perspective, it is exactly what this marriage was meant to achieve. Rowan met her gaze. And from your perspective? Issa looked down at her hands. I don't know. She spoke quietly. I agreed to take Grace's place for the sake of peace between our families. But no one explained what happens after the lie. Rowan ran a hand through his hair, a rare sign of discomfort. Issa! He stopped, then continued carefully. You should not feel pressured into fulfilling expectations that were built on deception. She lifted her eyes. And what do you feel? The question hung in the quiet room. Rowan did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that the air between them felt warmer. When I first learned the truth, he said slowly, I saw you only as a problem. Issa did not flinch. That seems fair. But that is no longer entirely true. Her heart beat faster. What changed? Rowan exhaled slowly. Time and honesty. And the fact that you have not attempted to manipulate or excuse what happened. His voice softened slightly. You have simply endured it. Issa studied him. And what does that mean for us? Rowan hesitated, then lifted his hand. For a moment it hovered uncertainly. Finally he brushed his fingers gently along her cheek. The touch was careful, almost hesitant. I do not know yet, he admitted quietly. But I do know one thing. What? I no longer see you as Grace's replacement. Issa's breath caught. Rowan's voice dropped slightly. I see you. The words carried more weight than either of them expected. Issa stepped closer. If we take a step beyond this, Rowan murmured, there will be no easy way back. Then don't step, she whispered. If you want to stop. But he didn't move away. His hand remained against her cheek, warm, steady. For the first time since their disastrous wedding, Rowan looked at her not with suspicion or duty, but with something far more dangerous. Desire, not overwhelming, not reckless, but unmistakable. Finally he lowered his hand. We should move slowly, he said quietly. Issa nodded. I agree. A faint smile touched his lips. Slow truth, he reminded her. Yes. She smiled softly in return. Slow truth. Later that night, Rowan escorted her to her chamber door as usual. They paused in the corridor. Neither seemed eager to end the evening. Tomorrow, Rowan said after a moment. Would you join me for dinner again? Issa tilted her head slightly. I thought that had already become tradition. His expression softened faintly. Perhaps it has. She opened the door, then hesitated. Good night, Rowan. The sound of his name in her voice still unsettled him. Good night, Issa. She stepped inside. The door closed quietly. Rowan remained standing in the corridor for several seconds, because something had changed that evening. The distance between them had narrowed, and Rowan Sinclair, who had sworn never to risk his heart again, felt the first unmistakable pull of something he could no longer dismiss if he was not careful. The woman he married through deception might become the one person capable of breaking him. Spring arrived slowly over the Scottish Highlands. The snow around Clydesmore Castle melted into silver streams that ran through the gardens, feeding the first fragile signs of life beneath the earth. For weeks, Rowan and Issa continued their quiet evenings together. Dinner, conversation, careful honesty. The fragile truce between them deepened into something neither had planned, something both of them were afraid to name. Yet the world beyond the castle walls had not forgotten their marriage, and eventually the past came knocking. The letter arrived on a gray morning. Issa recognized the seal immediately. Her father. She hesitated before opening it. Rowan watched from across the library. What is it? Issa unfolded the parchment slowly. Her face paled as she read. They are asking again, she whispered. Asking what? Her fingers trembled slightly. Whether the marriage has been fulfilled. Rowan understood instantly. An heir, he said quietly. Issa nodded. My father believes the alliance means nothing without one. Silence filled the library. Rowan stepped toward her. For them, this marriage is still a transaction. Issa lowered her gaze. And what is it for you? The question surprised him. Rowan did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her. The woman who had entered his life as a deception. The woman who had challenged every wall he built around himself. Finally, he spoke. When I married you, he said carefully, I believed I had been trapped by a lie. Issa's chest tightened. But now, Rowan took another step closer. Now I believe something very different. What? His voice lowered. I believe I have been given a second chance. Issa's breath caught. Rowan reached for her hand. This time there was no hesitation. No one has ever forced me to understand another person the way you have. His fingers tightened gently around hers. You are stubborn. You argue. You refuse to behave like the Duchess society expected. Issa's cheeks flushed. That hardly sounds flattering. Rowan smiled faintly. And yet those are the reasons I admire you. Her heart raced. Rowan. He lifted his other hand and touched her cheek. Not cautiously this time. Confidently. Issa McLaren, he said softly. I do not want an heir because your father demands one. I want a future with you because I choose it. Emotion flooded her chest so suddenly she could barely breathe. You choose me? Yes. He brushed his thumb along her cheekbone. Not grace. Not obligation. You. For a moment Issa could only stare at him. Then she whispered, You realize that choosing me may lead to disaster. Rowan's expression softened. My life has already known disaster. His gaze deepened. But loving you might make it worthwhile. The confession hung in the air between them, and this time neither of them stepped back. Issa moved first, closing the small distance between them. When Rowan kissed her, the gesture was no longer careful or uncertain. It was steady, certain, the kiss of a man who had finally stopped running from what he wanted. When they parted, Issa rested her forehead lightly against his. I was so afraid you would hate me forever, she whispered. Rowan gave a quiet laugh. I tried. But you are remarkably difficult to hate. Issa smiled through the tears forming in her eyes. What happens now? Rowan glanced toward the brightening gardens outside. Now we write to your father. And tell him the truth. Her heart skipped. All of it? All of it. Rowan's voice carried the calm authority of a duke making a final decision. The deception. The marriage. And the fact that his daughter is no longer a bargaining piece. Issa squeezed his hand. And if he objects? Rowan smiled faintly. He will discover something unfortunate. What? That the Duke of Clydesmore is far more stubborn than his daughter. Issa laughed softly. For the first time since arriving at Clydesmore, the future did not feel like a trap. It felt like possibility. Several weeks later, Issa stood in the castle gardens beside the first blooming roses of spring. Rowan joined her quietly. "They are finally blooming," she said. "Yes." He slipped an arm around her waist. "So are we." Issa leaned gently against him. The lie that brought her here had nearly destroyed them both. But the truth had rebuilt something stronger. Something chosen. Something real. Rowan pressed a soft kiss against her temple. "Welcome home, Duchess." Issa smiled, because this time the title finally felt like it belonged to her. And this marriage, once built on deception, had become something neither of them expected. Love.